Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. I was 8 years old when this happened. And even now, years later, the memory still feels sharp, like it never fully faded. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't something my mind exaggerated over time. I remember it clearly, moment by moment, and what scares me the most isn't just what happened, but how calm I was during it. That part still confuses me to this day. It was a normal school day, nothing special about it at all. I came home in the afternoon like I always did. Dropped my backpack on the floor and unpacked it in my room. Homework on the desk, lunchbox in the kitchen, shoes kicked off near the door. The house felt normal, quiet, but normal. My parents weren't home yet, which wasn't unusual. My older brother usually got home before dinner, but sometimes he stayed out longer. None of that felt strange at the time. I remember the house being still, no TV on, no music. Just that soft, empty house quiet. Then I heard a loud bang. It came from somewhere downstairs. It wasn't extremely loud, but loud enough to notice. My first thought was that my brother had come home and slammed a door or dropped something. He wasn't exactly gentle, so that explanation made sense to me. I didn't feel scared. I didn't even stop what I was doing. I just assumed it was him and kept unpacking my bag. About a minute later, I heard footsteps. They were on the stairs. Again, I assumed it was my brother. The sound matched what I expected. Someone walking up one step at a time, not rushing. I remember thinking I'd probably hear him come into his room soon or call my name. I didn't feel worried yet. I was still calm, still operating on autopilot. Then, a few seconds later, my phone buzzed. I remember exactly where I was sitting when I looked at it. I was on my bed, near the edge, backpack still half open on the floor. I picked up my phone and saw a text from my brother. It said, "Hey OP, I'm not going to be home till dinner." My heart dropped instantly. There was no slow realization, no confusion, just immediate fear, the kind that hits your stomach and makes everything feel cold. My brain tried to argue with itself for a second, like maybe the footsteps were something else, maybe I imagined them, maybe someone else was home. But I knew someone was in the house with me. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't run downstairs, I don't know why. I was 8 years old, and looking back it feels unreal that I stayed that quiet. I called out for my parents instead, my voice shaking but not loud. "Mom? Dad?" No answer. The house stayed silent. Then I heard movement again. This time it was closer. Someone was walking toward my room. I remember my entire body freezing. My mind went blank except for one clear thought. Hide. I slid off the bed and crawled underneath it as fast as I could. My bed was low and the space underneath barely fit me, but I squeezed in and pressed myself flat against the floor. I pulled my knees in tight and tried not to breathe too loudly. I could hear footsteps outside my door, slow, heavy, not rushed. The door didn't slam open. It just opened normally, like whoever it was wasn't panicking or in a hurry. That scared me more than anything. If it had been fast or loud, maybe I would have thought they were in a rush to grab something and leave. But this felt calm, controlled. I could see their feet from under the bed. They stood there for a moment. I don't know how long, but it felt like forever. I remember staring at the floor, afraid to blink, afraid that any movement would give me away. I was sure they could hear my heart pounding. I was sure they would bend down and look under the bed, but they didn't. They walked around my room instead. I heard drawers open. I heard small sounds, things being touched or moved. I stayed completely still. I didn't cry. I didn't make a sound. I don't understand how I managed that. I was terrified, but something in me just shut down and went quiet. Eventually, they stopped moving. I heard footsteps again, this time going away from my room. Then the front door opened. Then it closed. The house was silent again. I stayed under the bed for a long time. I don't know how long exactly. Minutes felt like hours. I didn't move until I was sure I couldn't hear anything else. When I finally crawled out, my legs were shaky and weak. The first thing I noticed was my piggy bank. It was gone. It wasn't anything special, just a small piggy bank I kept on a shelf. It had $5.25 in it. I remember the exact amount because I had counted it the day before and felt proud of it. That was all the money I had in the world at 8 years old. That's when it really hit me that this wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had broken into my house. I don't know what else they took that day. I was too shaken to check properly. All I could think about was that someone had been standing in my room while I hid under my bed. Someone had walked around, touched my things, and left without knowing how close they were to finding me. I called my parents right after. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that my voice finally broke when they answered. They rushed home immediately. When they got there, they were terrified. My mom hugged me so tight it hurt. My dad checked every room, every door, every window. They were worried sick. The police were called. Questions were asked. Doors and locks were checked. I answered as best as I could, but I was still shaking. Even then, I didn't cry the way people expected me to. I was quiet, distant, like my emotions were locked behind a door I couldn't open yet. What still confuses me is that part. I was a kid who cried over small things, scraped knees, bad dreams, getting in trouble. But during something genuinely terrifying, I stayed silent. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't panic out loud. I hid and waited. Looking back now, I think that might be what saved me. If I had cried, they might have heard me. If I had screamed, they might have searched the room more carefully. If I had run, I might have run straight into them. Instead, I stayed still, and they left. That realization makes my skin crawl. Even now, years later, the memory still comes back sometimes. Not in flashes, but in quiet moments. When I'm home alone and hear a noise. When I hear footsteps in a hallway. When my phone buzzes unexpectedly. My heart still jumps the same way it did when I read that text from my brother. What scares me most isn't just that someone broke in. It's how close they were. They were in my house, in my room, standing just a few feet from where I was hiding, and I'll never know who they were, why they came in, or what would have happened if they had looked under the bed. I think about that sometimes, and it still makes my chest feel tight. I also think about how young I was, 8 years old, alone, dealing with something no child should ever have to deal with, and somehow, without understanding it, my body knew what to do. That day changed how safe home felt to me. Home was supposed to be the place where nothing bad could happen. After that, I understood, even as a kid, that bad things don't care about rules like that. They don't announce themselves, they just walk in quietly while you're unpacking your backpack after school. And sometimes the only thing that stands between you and something worse is a text message that arrives at the exact wrong moment. In 2002, a young man named Joshua Guimond vanished in a way that still feels unfinished, unsettling, and deeply wrong, even decades later. His disappearance wasn't dramatic in the moment. There was no struggle, no witnesses reporting screams, no obvious crime scene. It was quiet, ordinary, and that is part of what makes it so disturbing. Josh was a student at St. John's University, a Catholic liberal arts college. By all accounts, he was intelligent, curious, and thoughtful. He wasn't known for reckless behavior. He wasn't someone who routinely disappeared or skipped obligations. He had a life that was moving forward in a normal, predictable way, the kind of life that doesn't just vanish without leaving something behind. On the night he disappeared, Josh had been at a small party on campus. It wasn't a wild event. Just a casual gathering, the kind that happens all the time at colleges. There had been some drinking at the party, but Josh's friends were clear about one thing. He hadn't been drinking that night. This wasn't a situation where someone was intoxicated, disoriented, or making unsafe decisions. He was sober, clear-headed, and acting normally. Around midnight, Josh left the party. His plan was simple. He was going to walk back to his dorm. The walk would have taken about 3 minutes. It was a short, familiar route he had likely taken countless times before. He didn't need a ride. He didn't need to check in with anyone. There was nothing unusual about him leaving alone. That moment, him walking away from the party, is the last confirmed sighting of Josh. Earlier that evening, around 8:30 p.m., Josh's roommate had left their dorm to go to the party. When the roommate returned later that night, Josh wasn't there. That wasn't immediately alarming. Josh had gone to the party after all. But when morning came and he still hadn't returned, concern began to grow. At first, people assumed there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he stayed with a friend. Maybe he went somewhere else to study or talk. College campuses are full of late nights and spontaneous decisions. But as hours turned into days, it became clear that something was very wrong. A search began. Authorities considered the possibility that Josh had fallen into one of the lakes on campus and drowned. St. John's University has multiple lakes, and water had to be taken seriously as a potential danger. Search dogs were brought in, and at least one dog reportedly led officers toward one of the lakes, which intensified that theory. All 3 lakes on campus were searched thoroughly. Nothing was found. No body, no clothing, no backpack, no personal items. Nothing that suggested Josh had entered the water. Despite extensive efforts, the drowning theory never produced any concrete evidence. It remained a possibility, but a weak one, especially given the lack of physical proof. As the investigation continued, other details began to surface, details that made the case feel more complicated and more uncomfortable. One of the most unsettling facts was what Josh had been working on before he disappeared. He was writing a paper about the university's response to sexual abuse allegations involving monks and priests on campus. This was not a casual topic. St. John's is a Catholic institution, and at the time, the broader Catholic Church was facing increasing scrutiny over sexual abuse scandals and how they were handled. Josh's paper reportedly examined how the university responded to abuse by clergy members connected to the school. This immediately raised questions. Josh was a student, but he was also investigating an institution that held significant power over his academic and social life. Writing critically about clergy abuse, especially in the early 2000s, was not a neutral or risk-free subject. It put him in a sensitive position, whether he intended that or not. As investigators followed leads, attention turned to an abbey on or near campus, known to house monks and priests. According to reports and long-standing rumors, this abbey had housed individuals who had been accused of or admitted to sexual abuse allegations. When authorities attempted to access the abbey during the investigation, they were refused entry. That refusal became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. From a public perspective, it looked suspicious. A missing student, a sensitive paper about clergy abuse, an abbey connected to accused priests, and investigators being denied access. Even if there were legal or procedural reasons for the refusal, the optics were terrible. It fueled speculation and distrust almost immediately. There were also reports, though not always clearly confirmed, that a bloodhound tracking Josh's scent may have led toward the abbey. Whether this was definitively proven or not remains unclear, but the idea itself became deeply embedded in the narrative surrounding his disappearance. Then there was Josh's computer. After he disappeared, Someone deleted around 300 files from his computer. That detail is chilling in its own right. These weren't files that vanished over time or due to a technical error. They were actively removed after Josh was gone. The timing alone raises serious questions. Who had access to his computer? Why would someone delete such a large number of files? What was in them? Were they related to his paper, personal notes, research, communications? No clear answers were ever given. As the investigation stalled and leads dried up, Josh's father refused to stop asking questions. He pushed the university for answers. He wanted transparency. He wanted access. He wanted accountability. From his perspective, his son had vanished on campus property, and the institution had a responsibility to do everything possible to help find him. Instead, the university filed a restraining order against him. They banned him from campus. That action shocked and angered many people. To outsiders, it looked like an institution choosing to protect itself rather than support a grieving parent searching for his missing child. Even if there were administrative reasons behind the decision, the emotional impact was devastating. A father already living with unimaginable uncertainty was now legally barred from the place where his son was last seen. That decision alone cemented suspicion in the minds of many. Over time, as official investigations failed to produce answers, rumors began to grow. They spread quietly at first, then more openly, passed from student to student, class to class, year to year. Even now, decades later, those rumors still circulate on campus. The most persistent rumor is that Josh was abducted by monks or priests, taken into the abbey, and never seen again. There is no proof of this. It is important to say that clearly. There is no evidence that definitively shows Josh was harmed by clergy members. There is no confirmed witness. There is no physical proof. The theory exists in the space left behind by unanswered questions, institutional silence, and deeply unsettling coincidences. But those coincidences are hard to ignore. A student researching clergy abuse disappears. Investigators are denied access to a key location. Files are deleted from his computer. His father is banned from campus, and the case goes cold without resolution. Even people who try to remain skeptical find themselves unsettled by how many things don't line up neatly. What makes Josh's disappearance especially haunting is how ordinary it began. He wasn't hitchhiking. He wasn't meeting a stranger. He wasn't engaging in risky behavior. He was walking across his own campus, a place that is supposed to be safe, familiar, and controlled. A 3-minute walk. That's all it was supposed to be. 3 minutes. That's barely enough time for anything to happen, and yet, in that span, he vanished completely. No witnesses came forward, no screams were reported, no struggle was found. It's as if he stepped off the face of the earth. The idea that someone could disappear so completely, in such a short distance, in such a controlled environment, is terrifying. It challenges our assumptions about safety and visibility. Campuses are often seen as protected bubbles, places where danger is minimal and help is close by. Josh's case shatters that illusion. It also raises uncomfortable questions about power. When institutions are involved, especially religious or academic ones, there can be layers of protection, legal complexity, and public relations concerns that don't exist in other cases. Even the perception of a cover-up can be enough to destroy trust. In Josh's case, many people feel that the university's actions, whether intentional or not, created barriers instead of clarity. Over the years, there have been occasional updates, renewed interest, and moments where people hoped the case might finally move forward. But each time, it fades again, unresolved. Josh's family has lived with that uncertainty for more than 2 decades. Not knowing is its own kind of torture. There is no closure, no grave to visit, no final answers, just questions that repeat endlessly. Was he scared? Was it quick? Did he suffer? Did he know something was wrong? Did he try to get help? Or did it happen so fast that he never had a chance? For students who attend St. John's University, Josh's story becomes part of the campus's unspoken history. New students hear about it eventually, maybe not in orientation, but through whispers, late-night conversations, or older students passing along the story. It becomes a cautionary tale, a mystery, something that feels almost unreal, until you remember that it involved a real person, a real family, a real life that stopped without explanation. Even people who don't believe the rumors, who reject the idea of institutional wrongdoing, often admit that the case leaves them uneasy. There are too many moments where transparency could have helped, but didn't. Too many actions that look defensive instead of cooperative. Too many missing pieces. Josh Guiman didn't disappear in the wilderness. He didn't vanish in a high-crime area. He didn't leave behind a trail of reckless behavior. He walked away from a party, sober, on his own campus, and was never seen again. That fact alone should keep this case alive. Whether the truth involves an accident, a crime, or something darker, Josh deserves answers. His family deserves answers, and the questions surrounding his disappearance deserve to be taken seriously, not dismissed as rumor or conspiracy simply because they make powerful institutions uncomfortable. It's possible that someday someone will come forward, a witness, a person who knows something they've been afraid to say, a piece of evidence that was overlooked. Time has a strange way of loosening secrets. Until then, Josh's story remains one of the most unsettling missing person cases connected to a college campus. Not because of what we know, but because of how much we don't know. And because of how many moments, decisions, and actions along the way make you stop and ask yourself, quietly but persistently, what really happened to him. This happened years ago, sometime around 2015, so a few details are fuzzy, but the core of it has never faded. It's one of those stories that lives in your head, not because it's dramatic in a cinematic way, but because of how close it came to ending very differently, and how much depended on seconds, instinct, and sheer luck. At the time, my friend was in Boy Scouts with me. We weren't especially close back then, but later we became friends outside of it. He was a good kid, responsible compared to the people he was with that night, which matters more than it should. He was riding around the country roads near Winchester with some older friends. Small town, rural roads, long stretches of nothing. The kind of roads people treat like racetracks because there's no traffic and no lights. Just darkness and overconfidence. They were speeding. Everyone knew they were speeding. No one stopped it. None of them were wearing seatbelts. At some point, things went wrong fast. I don't remember if they clipped a shoulder, overcorrected, or lost traction, but the car rolled. Not a gentle rollover either. It flipped hard, probably 3 times, end over end or side to side, violent enough to turn the inside of the car into chaos. My friend somehow stayed conscious. As the car rolled, he braced himself in a way that sounds almost unreal when you picture it. He held on to the 2 people in the back seat, while also trying to keep himself anchored by pushing against the ceiling. With no seatbelts, everyone was basically weightless, bodies flying where physics decided to throw them. He smashed his head against the back window at least once, maybe more, but he didn't let go. When the car finally stopped rolling, everything went quiet. That's when they realized someone was missing. One of the passengers, a girl who had been in the front, had been ejected through the passenger side window. She wasn't nearby in a way you could immediately see. They stumbled out of the wreck, disoriented, hurt, bleeding, adrenaline masking what would later become real pain, and started looking. They found her. She was lying away from the car, motionless. No heartbeat, no breathing, no response, not a gasp, not a twitch, nothing. In that moment, she was dead by every practical measure, and my friend didn't freeze. He didn't scream. He didn't collapse. He didn't wait for someone else to take over. He started CPR, not perfectly, not like a textbook, but with everything he had. Compressions, breaths, over and over. 2 minutes doesn't sound like much, but when you're doing CPR on someone you know, in the dark, in the middle of nowhere with injuries of your own, 2 minutes feels endless. And somehow it worked. She came back, breathing again. A pulse. Life where there had been nothing seconds before. That alone is incredible, but the nightmare wasn't over. They were still in the middle of nowhere. No signal, no way to call for help. Everyone was injured to some degree. Shock was setting in. At some point, they saw headlights. A car. They waved. They shouted. They did everything they could to get the driver's attention. This was their lifeline. Someone with a phone. Someone who could get help fast. The car didn't stop. It just drove past them and disappeared down the road. That detail is one of the hardest to sit with. Knowing that someone saw a crashed car, people on the roadside, and chose to keep going. Whether it was fear, indifference, or not fully understanding what they were seeing, it didn't matter in that moment. Help passed them by. With no other option, they started walking, injured, shaken, one of them having literally been dead minutes earlier. They walked along dark country roads until they finally reached a spot where they could get a signal and call 911. When emergency services eventually arrived, the reality of how close they had come began to sink in. Later that night, the driver went back to the crash site. That's when they realized something else that still makes my stomach drop. If the car had flipped just a little later, just a few feet down the road, it would have wrapped around a telephone pole. Not clipped it, wrapped around it. The kind of impact that doesn't leave survivors. Everyone would have died. Every single one of them. Instead, they flipped where they did. Instead, my friend reacted instead of freezing. Instead, CPR worked. Instead, they survived long enough to get help. The story hinges on a series of instead moments that are so fragile, it's terrifying. What stays with me isn't just the violence of the crash. It's the responsibility my friend carried in that moment, holding people in place while the car rolled, taking hit after hit and staying conscious, bringing someone back from death with his own hands, watching a car pass them by and realizing they were still alone, walking injured through the dark because there was no other choice. That's not something you train for as a teenager. That's something that changes you. Even now, when I think about it, I'm struck by how easily this could have been a very different story. One more roll, one wrong angle, 1 second delay in starting CPR, one less breath, one pull instead of open space. We hear so many stories that start with "they were speeding" and end with funerals. This one didn't. Not because they were careful, but because luck and instinct intervened at just the right moments. It's a reminder that seatbelts aren't optional, that rural roads aren't safe just because they're empty, that seconds matter, and that sometimes the difference between life and death is someone refusing to give up when everything says it's already over. I don't think any of them walked away from that night unchanged. I know I didn't, just hearing it. My uncle worked as an elevator operator and maintenance technician. Not the kind of elevators most people think about. The quiet ones in offices or apartment buildings with mirrors and soft music. He worked on the heavy-duty kind. Industrial elevators, the massive, loud, unforgiving machines designed to carry cargo, equipment, and weight far beyond what a human body could ever withstand. He helped build them, maintain them, repair them. It was dangerous work, but it was also familiar work. He knew those machines inside and out. He respected them and he was careful. This happened about 10 years ago now. Even saying that out loud feels strange because it still feels recent in my mind. Some events don't fade with time. They just move to a quieter place in your thoughts and wait there. That day, he was working with a coworker. Nothing unusual about that either. Jobs like that are almost never done alone. There are procedures, roles, communication protocols. One person handles controls. One person works on the machinery itself. Everyone knows where everyone else is supposed to be. I wasn't there, obviously. Everything I know comes from reports, from what family was told, from the bits and pieces that filtered down afterward. But even secondhand, the image is burned into my brain. My uncle was underneath the elevator. He was down there fixing something. I don't know the exact component. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that he was in the one place you never want to be if something goes wrong. Under thousands of pounds of steel, cables, and mechanisms that don't forgive mistakes. His coworker was above, at the controls, and somehow the elevator was lowered. The official story was that it was an accident, that the coworker didn't know my uncle was underneath, that it was unintentional. Words like accidentally and unknowingly were used. Those words get used a lot when something goes horribly wrong and no one wants to or can fully explain how. The elevator came down while my uncle was still under it. There was no time, no warning, no second chance. It crushed his skull instantly. I don't know who found him. I don't know what the coworker saw or heard in that moment. I don't know how long it took for anyone to fully understand what had happened. I don't know if there was shouting or silence or panic or shock so intense it felt unreal. What I do know is that one moment my uncle was alive, doing his job like he had done so many times before, and the next, he was gone. The call came later. That's how these things always happen. You don't hear about it as it's unfolding. You hear about it afterward when it's already irreversible. When the words are chosen carefully and spoken slowly, because the person on the other end of the line knows they're about to change your life. I remember the surreal feeling more than anything else. It didn't feel real. It felt like one of those news stories you hear in passing, the ones that make you shake your head and think, that's awful, and then move on. You always think of those things as distant, as tragedies that happen to strangers, to people you'll never meet, in places you'll never go. You never expect it to be your family. You never expect it to be someone whose voice you recognize instantly, someone whose laugh you've heard at holidays, someone whose hands you've shaken, whose presence has always been part of the background of your life. That's what made it so disorienting. My brain kept trying to reject the information. It felt like a mistake, like someone had mixed up names, like there was some crucial detail missing that would suddenly make it make sense. I remember thinking, this can't be right, because it doesn't fit into the world the way I understand it. But it was right. And the world doesn't ask for permission before it shatters the version of safety you were carrying around. The aftermath was strange in its own way. There were questions. There were investigations. There were official statements that tried to sound neutral and factual, stripping the event of emotion so it could be processed on paper. But no amount of procedure can soften something like that for the people left behind. There's a particular cruelty to workplace accidents. They happen in places where routine is supposed to protect you, where training, experience, and familiarity are meant to reduce risk. When something goes wrong there, it feels like a betrayal of that unspoken agreement. You do everything right. You follow the rules. You show up and do your job. And still, something catastrophic happens. It forces you to confront how fragile life really is. My uncle wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. He wasn't doing something wild or dangerous for fun. He was working, providing, using skills he'd built over years. And that's what makes it harder to accept. There's no easy lesson, no simple moral, no obvious mistake you can point to and say, that's why. Just a chain of events that ended in the worst possible outcome. What stuck with me was how suddenly he was gone. There was no goodbye, no last conversation that felt meaningful in hindsight, no chance to prepare emotionally. One day he existed in our lives the way he always had. The next day we were talking about him in the past tense. Grief in situations like that is strange. It doesn't come in a straight line. It comes in waves that don't announce themselves. One moment you're numb, functioning on autopilot, doing what needs to be done. The next moment something small triggers it. A memory, a sound, a random thought about how he would have reacted to something happening now. I remember thinking a lot about his coworker, not in an accusatory way, but in a deeply human way. I can't imagine what it must be like to live with that. Whether it truly was an accident or the result of a misunderstanding, the knowledge that your actions led to someone's death is a burden most people never have to carry. There are no winners in situations like that. Just layers of loss that spread outward. At the same time, there's anger, not always directed at a person, but at the situation itself, at the systems that allow for miscommunication, at the fact that something so heavy and powerful can be controlled by a single action, at the reality that even with safety measures, humans are still involved, and humans make mistakes. I think about elevators differently now. Every time I step into one, especially a freight elevator or an older one, there's a flicker of awareness that wasn't there before. I think about cables and counterweights and emergency brakes. I think about how much weight is above and below me. I think about how much trust we place in machines we don't really understand. Most people never think about the people who build and maintain those machines. They just assume they work. My uncle was one of the people who made them work, and he paid for that with his life. What makes it harder is how impersonal the language around accidents can be. Words like incident and fatality and workplace accident flatten something deeply personal into something abstract. But for us, it wasn't abstract at all. It was a face, a name, a presence missing from family gatherings, a chair that stayed empty. 10 years is a long time, and also no time at all. Life moved on because it has to. People aged, kids grew up, new memories were made. But there's a quiet line in our family history where everything before and after that day feels slightly different. I still think about the moment I learned what happened, about how my body reacted before my mind fully caught up, about the heaviness in my chest, about the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, even if I couldn't articulate it yet. You hear about freak accidents all the time, on the news, in passing conversations, as cautionary tales. They're always framed as rare, unfortunate events, statistical outliers, things that probably won't happen to you, until they do, until they happen to someone whose phone number you have saved, someone whose birthday you remember, someone who was never supposed to be just a story. That's the part that never really leaves you, the realization that safety is, in many ways, an illusion we agree to believe in so we can function. Most days, that illusion holds, and then one day, it doesn't, and you're left staring at the gap it leaves behind. I don't think about this story every day anymore, but when I do, it still feels surreal. Like it belongs to another reality, one that shouldn't overlap with mine. And yet it does because it's part of my life now, woven into who I am and how I see the world. It taught me that tragedy doesn't always come with drama or warning. Sometimes it comes disguised as routine, as normalcy, as just another day at work. And sometimes the people who pay the highest price are the ones who were simply doing their jobs, trusting that everything would work the way it always had before. That's the part that still hurts. I was the only daughter in my family. I had one older brother and two younger brothers, and for as long as I can remember, that fact shaped the way I saw myself growing up. I loved my brothers, but there was always a quiet loneliness that came with being the only girl. I didn't have a sister to share things with. No one who understood the small, unspoken stuff that felt different from what my brothers experienced. As a kid, I didn't have the language to explain it properly, but I felt it all the time. When I was little, I used to complain about it to my mom. Not in an angry way, just in that sad, honest way. Children talk when they feel something is missing, but don't know how to fill the gap. I remember one particular day very clearly, because it ended up changing the way I understood my family forever. I must have been pretty young, still calling her Mommy, still thinking of my family in simple numbers and roles. We were talking casually, not sitting down for some serious conversation. It felt like one of those everyday moments that shouldn't matter much, the kind that usually fades from memory. But this one didn't. I said, "Mommy, I wish I had a sister to play with." I remember expecting her to reassure me, maybe say something like, "You don't need a sister," or "Your brothers love you," or even just laugh it off. Instead, she said something that caught me completely off guard. She said, "Yeah, two girls would have been nice, but who knows, maybe you'd still be the only girl." That confused me immediately. As a child, families felt fixed and logical. You had the siblings you had, and that was it. Her answer sounded like she was talking about some alternate version of reality I didn't understand. I asked her, "What do you mean?" She replied, very casually, "Well, you'd probably have more brothers than sisters." That made even less sense to me. I pressed her, trying to understand, asking, "How?" She said, "I don't know, but I only wanted 4 kids. You were almost my third baby. Actually, you are my third baby." That stopped me cold. In my mind, I had always been the second child. My older brother was first, then me, then my 2 younger brothers. That was how I understood my place in the world. Birth order mattered to me in that quiet way it matters to kids. Being second meant something. It was part of how I defined myself. So I immediately corrected her. "No, Mommy, I'm the second baby." She shook her head and said, "Actually, you're the third." I remember feeling a strange mix of frustration and disbelief. Adults weren't supposed to get things like that wrong, especially not your own mother. I said, "That makes no sense." That's when she told me. She said it calmly, no hesitation, no visible emotion, as if she were explaining something ordinary, like why the sky is blue or why we need to eat dinner. She said, "Oh, right, I never told you. You see, before your big brother was born, I was pregnant with another boy, my first baby. He died at birth. You could have had 2 older brothers." I didn't know how to react. I don't even remember what I said afterward, if I said anything at all. I just remember feeling completely stunned. My brain couldn't process it. I was a child, and suddenly my understanding of my family wasn't just incomplete, it was wrong. There had been someone before all of us, a brother I never knew existed, a life that ended before it ever really began, but that still counted, still mattered enough to shift everything I thought I knew about myself. What shocked me the most wasn't just the information itself, but the way she delivered it. She didn't cry, she didn't pause, she didn't soften her voice or brace me for it. She said it like it wasn't a big deal, like she was mentioning an old recipe she tried once or a place she used to live. As a kid, that made it even harder to understand. If this was something so big, something so heavy, why didn't it feel heavy to her in that moment? I remember sitting there, quiet, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the brother I never met, about how different everything could have been if he had lived. Would I still have been the only girl? Would I have felt less lonely growing up? Would my family dynamic have been completely different? I started replaying memories in my head, even though none of them included him. Family photos, holidays, birthdays, moments that felt full but now suddenly felt like they had an invisible gap in them. It was like realizing a puzzle you've been staring at your whole life is missing a piece you never noticed before. As I got older, that conversation stayed with me. At first, it just felt strange. Then it started to feel sad. Then eventually, it became something deeper. I began to understand that my mother's calmness didn't necessarily mean it wasn't painful. Sometimes people survive loss by compartmentalizing it so thoroughly that it becomes almost invisible, even to themselves. What felt shocking and destabilizing to me might have been something she had already buried away just to keep functioning. But as a child, I didn't have that perspective. All I knew was that my place in the family wasn't as simple as I thought. I wasn't the second baby, I was the third. There had been someone before my oldest brother, someone who should have been there but wasn't. That realization made me feel a strange kind of grief, even though I had never known him. It was grief for a relationship that never had the chance to exist. I started wondering what kind of brother he would have been. Would he have been protective, quiet, loud? Would he have teased me the way my older brother did? Would he have made growing up as the only girl easier or harder? These questions had no answers, but they stayed with me anyway. As a child, imagination fills in the blanks whether you want it to or not. It also made me think differently about my mom. Before that conversation, I saw her mostly as just Mom, someone who had always been there, someone strong, someone who knew everything. Afterward, I realized she had lived a whole life before I was even born, full of experiences and pain I knew nothing about. She had carried a baby, given birth, and lost him, all before I ever existed. That kind of loss leaves a mark, whether it's visible or not. As I grew older, I started to see how that loss might have shaped her in subtle ways. The way she talked about family, the way she approached pregnancy and children, the fact that she only wanted 4 kids, the fact that numbers mattered to her in a way I hadn't understood before. When she said she only wanted 4 kids and that I was almost her third, it wasn't just a slip of the tongue, it was her reality. I think about how casually she told me sometimes, even now. I don't think she meant to hurt me or confuse me. I think she assumed I was old enough to hear it, or maybe she just didn't realize how deeply it would affect me. Adults often forget that children don't have the same emotional armor they do. What feels like old, settled history to them can feel like an earthquake to a child. For a long time, I didn't talk about it much. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't bring it up again. Part of me didn't want to. Another part of me didn't know how. I just carried it quietly, letting it reshape my inner world without anyone noticing. That's something kids do a lot. They absorb things silently. As I got older, the sadness shifted into something more reflective. I started to understand that my mother's loss wasn't something she owed me explanations for, that her calmness wasn't indifference, but survival, that the brother I never had was still part of our family's story, even if he never got to live in the world the way the rest of us did. Still, there's a lingering ache that never fully goes away, the idea that things could have been different, that my loneliness as the only girl might have taken a different shape, that my family might have felt fuller in a way I can't quite define. It's not a dramatic ache, not something that overwhelms me, but it's there, quietly, in the background. Sometimes I think about how strange it is that one short conversation can change how you see your entire life. Before that day, my family tree felt straightforward. Afterward, it felt deeper, more complicated, layered with unseen roots and branches that never grew. It made me realize that every family carries stories like that, losses that aren't obvious but still shape everything that comes after. Even now, when I think about my place in the family, I think of myself as the third child, not the second. That shift matters to me. It's a way of acknowledging that someone came before us, someone who existed, even if briefly, and whose absence still echoes. I don't feel angry about it. Mostly I feel thoughtful, a little sad, a little tender, and aware of how fragile life really is, even before it officially begins. I also feel a strange kind of connection to that brother I never met, not because I knew him, but because his existence changed mine in ways I didn't understand until much later. That conversation stayed with me not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. It was said in a normal voice, on a normal day, without ceremony or warning, and yet it opened a door in my mind that never fully closed. It made me aware, at a young age, that families aren't just made of the people you see. They're also made of the ones who were almost there. I was 11 years old when this happened, and even now, years later, I can still feel it in my body when I think about it. Not the pain exactly, but the sensation of time slowing down, of realizing something irreversible was about to happen and being completely powerless to stop it. That moment changed how I understood danger, death, and luck, even if I didn't have the words for it at the time. It was a normal day in our small town, the kind of town where the park is the center of everything for kids. No big attractions, no fancy playground equipment, just open grass, picnic tables, and a few old trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Those trees were magnets for us. We climbed them all the time. It was one of those things parents vaguely discouraged but never really stopped, because everyone did it and nothing bad had happened before. That day, a group of us were hanging out at the park, bored in the way kids get bored when there's nothing structured to do. Someone suggested climbing one of the taller trees. Not just climbing it, but racing to see who could get the highest. Immediately, it turned competitive. That's how kids are. What starts as messing around turns into something you have to win. The tree we chose was one of the bigger ones in the park. Its first branch was ridiculously high, probably around 12 feet off the ground, too high to reach just by jumping. Normally, that would have stopped us, but there were picnic tables nearby. Someone dragged one over, then another. We stacked them just enough to give ourselves a boost. Looking back now, the setup alone should have been a warning sign. Wobbly tables on uneven ground, kids scrambling over each other, no adult supervision. But at 11, you don't think in those terms. Once you got onto that first branch, the climb really began. From there, you could go another 12 to 15 feet higher if you were brave enough and quick enough. The branches got thinner the higher you went, but when you're a kid, thin branches don't look fragile. They just look like the next step. We took turns climbing, yelling up and down at each other, daring each other to go higher. When it was my turn, I was determined to win. I remember that feeling clearly, the tunnel vision, the way everything else faded except the goal of getting higher than everyone else. I wasn't thinking about safety or strategy. I wasn't testing branches. I wasn't planning my moves. I was just grabbing and pulling, faster and faster. Near the top of the tree, my heart was pounding, partly from the effort and partly from excitement. I could hear my friends below me, their voices sounding far away, distorted by distance and adrenaline. I reached for the next branch without really looking at it. I didn't check how thick it was. I didn't test it with my weight first. I just grabbed it and committed fully, all my momentum going into that one motion. The branch snapped. It didn't crack slowly or give a warning. It broke instantly, cleanly, like it had never been meant to hold anything at all. There was a split second where my brain hadn't caught up to what had happened yet. My hand was still in the shape of grabbing something, but there was nothing there. That's when time slowed down. I remember this part in a way that feels almost unreal. The realization came in a rush, sharp and absolute. I knew I was going to fall. There was no doubt, no hope that I could grab something else in time. Gravity had already taken over. My body was moving backward, not down, and I couldn't control it. I flew back through the air, my limbs flailing uselessly. I had no sense of where the ground was or how far away it felt. All I knew was that I was falling fast. I didn't have time to scream. I didn't have time to brace myself. My body just went where physics sent it. I landed hard. The impact was brutal. I came down with a heavy thud on the topmost part of my spine, the upper back area where your neck meets your shoulders. The force knocked the air completely out of me. It was like my lungs forgot how to work. I opened my mouth to breathe, but nothing happened. No air came in. No sound came out. For a few terrifying seconds, I thought I was going to suffocate. There was a loud ringing in my ears like a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. It felt like the world had gone underwater. I could see shapes moving, but they didn't make sense. I could hear my friends yelling, but the words were muffled, stretched, and unintelligible, like someone was talking through a wall. I lay there, stunned, my body not fully responding to my brain yet. Eventually, my lungs spasmed and dragged in a breath on their own. It burned, sharp and painful, but it was the most relieving sensation I had ever felt. I coughed and gasped, trying to get my breathing under control. As the ringing slowly faded, I became more aware of where I was. I could hear my friends more clearly now. They sounded panicked, shouting my name, asking if I was okay. Their voices were still distant, but not as distorted as before. Instinct kicked in. I tried to roll over so I could stand up. That's when something felt wrong in a way I didn't expect. I shifted my weight and realized my body wasn't moving the way it should if I were on the ground. The surface beneath me wasn't flat. It was uneven, solid, but curved. I wasn't on the ground. I was still in the tree. Somehow, in the chaos of the fall, I had landed on the very first branch, the starting branch, the one that had been 12 feet off the ground. It had caught me, stopping my fall before I hit the earth below. I had fallen backward and down, but not far enough to miss it entirely. That realization hit me harder than the physical pain. I just lay there for a moment, staring at leaves and sky, trying to process what had happened. My friends were still yelling, but now their voices sounded different, relieved, frantic, disbelieving. Carefully, slowly, I shifted again and managed to sit up. Everything hurt, but nothing felt broken in a way I could immediately tell. With help and a lot of shaking legs, I eventually made my way down the tree. Once my feet touched the ground, the adrenaline started to wear off. That's when the pain really kicked in. My back screamed in protest. My muscles felt like they were on fire. Tears filled my eyes and I started crying, but it wasn't just because of the pain. As I stood there, bent over and shaking, the reality of what had almost happened finally sank in. If that branch hadn't caught me, I would have fallen about 25 feet straight to the ground. I had no control over how I was falling. I had landed on my upper spine by sheer chance. If I had fallen just a little differently, I could have hit my head or neck directly. A fall like that doesn't usually end well. At 11 years old, I didn't have a detailed understanding of spinal injuries or traumatic brain damage, but I knew enough to understand one thing very clearly. I came incredibly close to dying, or worse, to surviving with injuries that would have changed my life forever. That thought terrified me in a way nothing else ever had. I remember crying harder after that realization than I did from the pain itself. It was the delayed fear, the what if that hit once everything was over. My friends tried to comfort me awkwardly, the way kids do when they don't know what to say. Someone ran to get an adult. I was checked over, taken home, monitored. I was sore for a long time, but I healed. Physically anyway. Mentally, something shifted that day. I started seeing risks differently. Not in a way that made me afraid of everything, but in a way that made me aware of how quickly things can go wrong. How a single careless decision made in a hurry can put you on a path you can't undo. How luck plays a bigger role in survival than people like to admit. I thought a lot about parallel possibilities afterward, even if I didn't call them that at the time. I thought about how easily the story could have ended differently. How in another version of events that branch didn't catch me. How in another version my friends ran for help, but it was too late. How in another version my parents got a phone call no parent should ever get. Those thoughts scared me deeply. But they also made me appreciate something I hadn't before: the randomness of survival, the thinness of the line between normal life and tragedy. Over time, the fear faded into something quieter, a kind of respect, maybe, for gravity, for trees, for the fact that not everything we survive is because we were skilled or smart. Sometimes we survive because something else intervened at the last possible moment. I joke now that I've forgiven the tree. It sounds silly, but it's true in a way. For a long time, I couldn't look at that tree without feeling a twist in my stomach. It felt like an enemy, like something that had betrayed me. As I got older, that feeling changed. The tree didn't hurt me out of malice. It didn't try to kill me. It simply existed. It broke where it was weak and held where it was strong. In the end, it's also the thing that saved me. That day taught me something I didn't fully understand until much later. Death isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet and almost invisible, waiting for you to make one small mistake. And sometimes survival comes down to something as simple and fragile as a branch being in exactly the right place. In a parallel universe, I didn't make it. In this one, I walked away shaken, bruised, and profoundly changed. And that knowledge, more than the pain, is what stayed with me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. I grew up in the mountains, in a place where the outdoors wasn't a hobby, so much as a default setting for life. If you wanted to do something after school or on weekends, you went outside. You hiked, you climbed, you skied when there was snow, and when the trails were clear, you rode bikes. Mountain biking wasn't a niche thing where I lived. It was normal. Everyone knew someone who did it seriously, and plenty of people were very, very good at it. Because of that, there was a certain confidence that came with experience. People trusted their skills. They trusted their reflexes. They trusted that they knew the land well enough to read it at speed. Most of the time, that confidence was justified. Accidents happened, sure, but they were usually broken bones, concussions, things people recovered from. There was an unspoken belief that if you were experienced enough, truly skilled, you could manage almost anything the mountain threw at you. That belief is part of what makes this story so hard to sit with. A few years ago, one of the most experienced riders in the area decided to take a trail that wasn't meant for bikes. It was a hiking trail, narrower than a bike trail, more winding, not built with speed in mind. People had walked it for years, maybe decades. It wasn't secret, but it also wasn't designed for someone flying downhill on two wheels. Why he chose it, no one really knows for sure. Maybe he'd ridden everything else and wanted something new. Maybe he underestimated the risk. Maybe he assumed that because he'd handled harder terrain before, this would be fine too. That's the thing about experience. It can protect you. But it can also convince you that you're immune to mistakes. Around the same time, someone else was using that same trail for something entirely different. Slacklining had become popular in the area. If you're not familiar with it, It's essentially a flat, flexible line stretched between two anchor points, usually trees. People balance on it, walk across it, practice tricks. In the mountains, with sturdy trees and scenic spots, it makes sense that people would set them up along trails or near them. On this particular trail, someone had set up a slack line that crossed directly through it, not above it, not clearly out of the way, across it, and at about neck height. The slackliner had anchored the line, set it up, and then left for a bit to go back to his car to grab something. He didn't put any lights on the line, even though that was required by law where we lived, specifically because of situations like this. Trails are shared spaces. People come through at different times, at different speeds, sometimes with limited visibility. The lights are meant to make sure everyone can see what's there before it's too late. While he was gone, the biker came down the trail. He was moving fast, downhill, enough speed that there was no real chance to stop suddenly. Hiking trails twist, they dip, they narrow unexpectedly. They aren't built to give riders long sight lines. And a slack line, especially one without lights, is almost invisible until you're right on top of it. He never saw it. There was no time to react, no braking, no swerving, no chance to duck or jump. The line was exactly where his body would be as he came down the trail, and the speed did the rest. He was decapitated instantly. It's brutal to even write that sentence because it feels unreal, like something out of a horror movie or an exaggerated urban legend. But it wasn't a story passed around to scare people. It was real. It happened. Someone who had spent years mastering his craft, someone who knew those mountains, died in one of the most sudden and violent ways imaginable. The slackliner came back to the trail a short time later. I can't even begin to imagine what that moment was like. He walked back expecting to continue his practice, maybe thinking about balance or technique or whatever small, ordinary thing was on his mind. Instead, he found a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. A body, blood. The immediate, unmistakable evidence that something had gone catastrophically wrong. No matter how you look at it, that's a nightmare. From one side, a man riding a trail he shouldn't have been on, trusting his skill and speed. From the other, someone setting up equipment without following safety rules, leaving it unattended in a shared space. Two decisions, neither made with malice, intersecting in the worst possible way. Afterward, the community was shaken in a way I hadn't really seen before. Mountain towns are used to risk. People accept that living close to nature comes with dangers, avalanches, rock slides, falls, wildlife encounters. But this felt different. This wasn't the mountain doing what the mountain does. This was human activity colliding with human activity with deadly consequences. People started talking about trail etiquette more seriously, about respecting what a trail is meant for. About not assuming you're alone just because you don't see anyone at that moment, about how invisible hazards can be when you're moving fast, and how little margin there is for error. It also forced people to think about responsibility in a more uncomfortable way. Was the biker at fault for riding a hiking-only trail? Was the slackliner at fault for setting up a line across it without lights and leaving it unattended? Was it an accident in the purest sense, or was it negligence? There were arguments, heated ones. Some people took sides. Others refused to because assigning blame didn't make the outcome any less horrific. What stayed with me wasn't the debate, though. It was the randomness of it. If the biker had gone a little slower, if he'd chosen a different trail that day, if the slackliner had stayed put, if he'd put lights on the line, if their timing hadn't overlapped by that small window, any one of those changes could have meant everyone went home that day. Instead, one man lost his life, and another was left with a trauma that would likely follow him forever. I think a lot about how quiet mountains can be after something like that happens, how the trail itself doesn't change, the trees don't move, The ground doesn't remember. People walk and ride past the spot later, maybe without even knowing what happened there. Nature absorbs tragedy without comment, but people don't. For those who knew about it, that trail was never just a trail again. It became a reminder of how fast things can turn, how thin the line is between skill and catastrophe, between a normal day and a moment that destroys multiple lives in different ways. The idea that someone could be doing something they love, something they've done 1,000 times before and be gone in an instant, is deeply unsettling. It challenges the belief that experience equals safety. It forces you to admit that no matter how good you are, you're still vulnerable to things you can't predict or see. And then there's the slackliner. I don't know what happened to him afterward. I don't know how he processed it, or if he ever set foot on a trail again. I just know that coming back to a scene like that, knowing your actions played a role even if you never intended harm, is the kind of burden that doesn't fade easily. That moment would replay in your mind forever. The what-ifs, the seconds, the choices. This story changed how a lot of people I know approach shared outdoor spaces. More caution, more communication, more respect for rules that used to feel optional or annoying. Because rules like putting lights on a line aren't about bureaucracy. They exist because people move through the world in ways you can't always anticipate. And when speed and invisibility collide, the consequences can be irreversible. Every time I think about it, I come back to how ordinary it all started. A skilled rider heading out for a ride, a slack liner setting up a line, a mountain trail that had been there long before either of them. Nothing about it felt destined or dramatic in advance. It was just a convergence of choices and timing, and that's what makes it so terrifying. Not the gore, not even the shock, but the understanding that tragedy doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly at neck height, unseen, until someone moving too fast has no chance to stop. It's a reminder I carry with me now every time I'm in the mountains. Respect the trail, respect the fact that you're not alone, even when it feels like you are, and never forget how unforgiving a single moment can be. I was 10 years old. My brother was 5. That's how this story starts, because that's the age when your brain is still soft enough to believe that adults know what they're doing, and that homes are supposed to be safe places. My father kicked my mother out of the house. I was too young to understand the full reasons, but old enough to feel the shock of it. One day there was a family, and the next day there wasn't. The word demon is the only one that ever felt accurate for her, not because of superstition, but because of the damage she carried and passed on. After that, we were sent to live with my mother and my stepfather in Elmo, Wyoming. Population 30. That number matters. It means there were no neighbors close enough to hear screams, no teachers who could miss bruises because there were barely any teachers at all. No place to disappear into and no place to run. Just land, silence, and isolation. The kind of isolation that lets cruelty grow without witnesses. My stepfather hated us from the start, not in a quiet, passive way, but in a way that felt active, intentional, like our existence offended him. He made it clear that we were not wanted. Every day felt like we were intruding on his life, simply by breathing. My brother was 5, I was 10. There was nothing we could do to earn kindness because kindness was never on offer. One of the first things he did was buy a Shetland pony. To someone outside of this story, that might sound like a gift. A pony for kids, something wholesome, something that looks good from a distance. But this pony hated people. I don't mean it was temperamental or stubborn. I mean it was violent. It bucked us on purpose. It threw us into rafters. It rolled over on us, heavy and deliberate. It bit us hard enough to leave marks. It tried to kill us in the way animals sometimes do when they're afraid, angry, or trained badly. And my stepfather knew it. He didn't stop it. He didn't correct it. He used it. He made us ride it anyway. He laughed when it scraped us against barbed wire fences, tearing skin and clothes. He laughed when it crushed us under its weight. He watched while it tried to mount us, a horrifying thing to witness as a child, something you don't even have language for yet. You just know it's wrong. You just know you're not safe. We were covered in cuts and bruises constantly. Some were small, some weren't. Pain became normal. Fear became routine. You wake up already braced for what might happen that day. That wasn't the worst of it. There were days when he doused us in lighter fluid. I remember the smell more than anything. Sharp, chemical. It sticks in your nose and doesn't leave. He threatened to set us on fire. Sometimes he flicked a lighter just to watch us panic. I don't know if he ever truly intended to do it, but at that age, the difference doesn't matter. When you're a child, believing you're about to burn alive is real enough. One day, he shot our dog. His name was Hobo. Hobo was gentle, he was loyal. He was the closest thing we had to protection, even if he couldn't really protect us. He was family in a way people weren't. My stepfather shot him in the head without warning. The bullet blew his brains everywhere. My little brother was right there. It covered him, his hair, his face, his clothes. I don't know how to explain what that does to a 5-year-old. I don't know how to explain what it does to the older sibling who sees it happen and realizes that this is not a man who loses control. This is a man who chooses. At some point, he threw me off a mountain. Not metaphorically, literally. We were out in the wilderness and he pushed me. I fell. I don't remember every detail of the fall. I remember the rush of air. I remember hitting things on the way down. I remember pain so sharp it felt white, like my brain couldn't process it properly. I remember thinking, very calmly, that this might be where I die. I didn't. I don't know why. Luck, terrain, something catching me, something slowing me down. I ended up alive. Broken in ways that took time to heal, but alive. When I think about it now, it feels unreal, like my survival wasn't supposed to happen. Like I slipped through something by accident. Later, when I was older, I went back to rescue my little brother. That wasn't a heroic decision. It was a desperate one. I couldn't leave him there. I couldn't live with knowing what he was enduring. I went back knowing I might not come out, knowing that the man who hurt us before would hurt us again if given the chance. When my stepfather realized what I was trying to do, he emptied a 6-shooter into our headboard. Bullets tore through wood inches from where our heads had been. The sound was deafening. The smell of gunpowder filled the room. Splinters flew. That's not a warning shot. That's attempted murder. There's no confusion about intent when someone does that. He took me out into the woods and tried to shoot me. Again, different day, same goal. There were moments when I thought this was just how my life would end. Not dramatically, not publicly, just quietly, somewhere no one would ever look. I started to accept that idea in a way that scares me now. When you're exposed to enough violence, you stop imagining a future. You only think in terms of surviving the next hour. At some point, he hired people to kill me. I don't know how many. I don't know who they were. I only know that I was told, directly and indirectly, that there were people looking for me, that I needed to stay hidden, that I needed to move carefully, that my life was still being hunted, even when he wasn't physically present. Living like that changes you. You don't relax. You don't trust. You don't feel safe in quiet places because quiet places are where the worst things happened. Loud places don't help either. You learn to read rooms instantly. You track exits without thinking. You notice tone shifts, posture changes, silence where there shouldn't be silence. People sometimes expect a story like this to end with justice. It doesn't. There was no neat resolution, no moment where someone stepped in and fixed everything, no apology, no accountability that made the damage go away. There was just distance, time, and survival. There was growing older and realizing how deeply abnormal your childhood was compared to everyone else's. I know this isn't what you expected. People usually expect ghosts or accidents or bad luck. This isn't that. This is sustained cruelty. It's adults abusing power over children who had no way to fight back. It's violence done deliberately, repeatedly, and without remorse. So if your instinct is to ignore this, I understand. Ignoring it is what people did back then too. Isolation makes it easy. Small towns make it easier. Families like mine fall through cracks because no one wants to look too closely at something that ugly. It's easier to believe it can't be that bad. It's easier to assume kids exaggerate. It's easier to look away. I survived anyway, not because I was strong in the way people like to romanticize. I survived because I adapted. I learned. I endured. Sometimes survival is just staying alive long enough for circumstances to change. Sometimes it's learning when to be quiet and when to run. Sometimes it's protecting someone smaller than you, even when you're scared yourself. I don't tell this story for shock. I tell it because it happened. Because pretending it didn't doesn't make it disappear. Because there are kids right now living in places just as isolated, just as silent, with adults who look normal from the outside and monstrous behind closed doors. And because even when you grow up in hell, even when you're thrown off mountains and shot at and hunted, it is still possible to live, not untouched, not unchanged, but alive. That matters more than people realize. I live in rural Tennessee, in a place where time feels layered, not frozen exactly, but stacked. New houses sit beside old ones, roads curve the same way they did centuries ago, and history doesn't feel distant the way it does in cities. It feels close, sometimes uncomfortably close. Across the street from my house is a cemetery that was founded in 1778. That alone already gives the place a certain weight. It's not a neat, manicured cemetery with rows of matching stones and clear records. Most of the graves are unmarked. There are a few headstones at the front near the road, worn smooth by time, names and dates barely legible. But the majority of the land is just uneven ground, depressions in the earth that you only recognize as graves once you know what you're looking at. There is one grave that stands out. It's at the back left corner of the cemetery, farthest from the road, near the tree line. The stone there is small and old and simple. It has just one word carved into it, Mary. No date, no last name, no epitaph, nothing else. Growing up, I didn't think much of it. Old cemeteries are full of mysteries. Records get lost. Stones break or disappear. Names fade. That's just history doing what history does. But the older I got, the more that single grave started to feel strange, especially when paired with other things. My cousins, who spent a lot of time at our house, always seemed uneasy about the cemetery. They talked about seeing things, shadows that moved where they shouldn't, sounds at night that didn't have a clear source. One of my cousins, when they were little, had an imaginary friend. Her name was Mary. At the time, no one connected the dots. Kids have imaginary friends. That's normal, and Mary is a common name. But looking back now, knowing what we know about that grave, it's hard not to feel a little chill when I think about it. Coincidence? Probably, but it's one of those coincidences that sticks with you. The night that really changed how I thought about that cemetery happened when my family was sitting on the porch together. It was around 10 p.m. Not late by rural standards, but dark. The only streetlight is on our side of the road. The cemetery itself has no lights at all. Once the sun goes down, it becomes a wide stretch of shadow, broken only by moonlight, if there is any. We were just sitting there, talking, nothing unusual, when someone noticed movement across the road. At first, it was subtle, just shapes shifting between the headstones. But the longer we watched, the clearer it became that these weren't animals. They were upright, moving deliberately, slowly. They looked like people. That alone was strange enough. There's no reason for anyone to be walking around that cemetery at night, especially in a group. It isn't a place people cut through. There are no paths that lead anywhere useful. It's isolated, quiet, and known locally as somewhere you don't mess around after dark. The movement continued. More figures became visible as our eyes adjusted. They were dressed darkly, blending into the shadows. It was impossible to tell how many there were at first, but it was clearly more than just one or two. My dad stood up. He didn't panic, he didn't shout. He just went inside and came back out with a revolver, not waving it around, not threatening anyone, but holding it in a way that made it clear he was serious. In rural areas, that kind of reaction isn't unusual. If something feels off on your property, you investigate, but you do it prepared. He crossed the road toward the cemetery while the rest of us stayed on the porch, watching. As he got closer, one of the figures stepped out from behind a tree. The man raised his hands immediately and yelled, "Don't shoot! We'll leave. Just don't shoot." That moment was surreal, not because of what he said, but how quickly he said it, like he had been expecting this exact scenario. My dad didn't advance. He didn't say much at all. He just told them to leave. The man nodded, and then something even stranger happened. More people emerged from behind the trees. About 10 of them. They were all wearing black hoodies, no visible faces. No visible symbols, just dark clothing that made them hard to distinguish from one another. They didn't argue, they didn't threaten, they didn't linger. They just turned and walked out of the cemetery and disappeared into the darkness beyond it. My dad came back to the porch, and we all sat there in silence for a moment, trying to process what we had just seen. 10 people hiding among graves at night. No explanation. We stayed on the porch longer than usual after that. No one felt like going inside right away. We wanted to make sure they didn't come back. We watched the cemetery closely, scanning for movement, listening for footsteps or voices. About 10 minutes passed. Then we saw movement again. This time it wasn't near the front of the cemetery. It was near the back left corner, near the grave that says Mary. 2 figures emerged from the shadows. They weren't wearing hoodies, they were wearing robes. Long robes, pointed hoods, the kind of shape you instantly recognize, even if your brain doesn't want to. They looked like KKK robes with the tall, pointed hats and the full-length garments. One robe was white, the other was completely black. I remember the way my stomach dropped when I saw them. There's something uniquely horrifying about seeing something so culturally loaded, so historically violent, standing in a place already associated with death. It didn't matter that they weren't doing anything overtly aggressive. The symbolism alone was enough to make the air feel heavier. They didn't look at us. They didn't come toward the road. They just walked away from the cemetery, moving slowly, deliberately, vanishing into the darkness the same way the others had. That was when we called the police. By the time officers arrived, the figures were gone. The police shined lights across the cemetery, between the trees, over the graves. They didn't find anyone. No footprints that could be clearly followed. No signs of activity that could be definitively tied to what we had seen. From a purely factual standpoint, there was nothing for them to act on. From a human standpoint, none of us slept easily that night. The next morning, my mom told a coworker about what had happened. The coworker listened quietly and then said something that added another layer to the whole thing. They said that black and white robes are traditional in some pagan rituals. I don't know how accurate that is. I haven't researched it deeply. But hearing that didn't make me feel better. It made it worse, because suddenly there were too many overlapping explanations, and none of them felt comforting. Maybe it was a group of people messing around in the cemetery for thrills. Maybe it was some kind of fringe ritual group. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe the robes weren't what we thought they were, and our fear filled in the gaps. But then there's the timing, the numbers, the way they hid among the graves, the way they immediately complied when confronted, the way two more figures appeared later, dressed differently, near the most isolated and oddly marked grave in the entire cemetery. And then there's Mary, the grave with no date, the imaginary friend, the way my cousins always felt watched near that corner of the cemetery. Individually, none of these things mean much. Together, they form a pattern that's hard to ignore, even if you want to, even if you don't believe in anything supernatural, even if you try to rationalize every detail. Living across from that cemetery has changed how I think about places. Some places carry stories, whether you know them or not. Some places absorb what happens in them and hold on to it. A cemetery founded in 1778 has seen more death, grief, secrecy, and ritual than any of us can really comprehend. Generations lived and died there long before our family ever arrived. I don't claim to know what we saw that night. I don't claim it was supernatural. I don't claim it was a cult. I don't even claim it was malicious in intent. What I know is that it was real. We saw people moving among the graves. We saw them leave. We saw two figures in robes emerge from the darkest corner of the cemetery. We felt the fear, the confusion, the disbelief, all at once. Even now, years later, when I look out across the road at night, my eyes automatically go to the back left corner, to Mary. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's all coincidence layered on coincidence. But when you live next to a place where centuries of lives ended, where names were lost, where stories were buried without markers, it's hard not to feel like you're sharing space with something you don't fully understand. That night didn't convince me of any one explanation. It just convinced me that there are things that don't fit neatly into categories, and that sometimes the scariest part isn't knowing what you saw, it's knowing that you saw something at all. When I was younger, my family lived in a neighborhood full of kids. It was the kind of place where children were always outside, riding bikes, playing tag, running from yard to yard without much supervision. Parents knew each other. Doors were often unlocked. Everyone assumed that if something went wrong, an adult would be close enough to step in. That belief made the neighborhood feel safe. At the time, I didn't question it. When you're a kid, safety isn't something you analyze. It's just something you assume exists, like gravity or daylight. Adults are in charge. Houses are solid. Fire is something you see on TV or in movies, not something that happens to people you know. Then one day, that illusion broke. There was a young boy who lived nearby. He couldn't have been older than 6. I remember that clearly because he was small, younger than most of the kids I played with. He had that look little kids have, where their faces still seem round and soft, where everything about them feels unfinished, like they're still in the middle of becoming who they're going to be. He liked to play. He liked to explore. He was curious in the way kids are curious before they understand consequences. No one thought much of it. Curiosity in children is normal. It's encouraged, even. Adults talk about letting kids learn, letting them experiment, letting them figure things out. That curiosity is what killed him. One day when he was inside his house, he found matches. I don't know where they came from. Maybe they were left on a counter. Maybe they were in a drawer that wasn't locked. Maybe someone assumed a child that young wouldn't think to use them. Whatever the reason, they were accessible, and he got hold of them. To him, matches probably seemed harmless. something adults used, something interesting, a tiny flame that appears and disappears. Kids don't understand fire as a living thing that spreads. They don't understand how fast it moves, how it feeds on air and material, how quickly it can turn a room into something unrecognizable. He started a fire inside the house. I don't know if it was intentional or accidental. I don't know if he was trying to light something specific or if he just struck a match and dropped it. Those details don't really matter. What matters is that once the fire started, it didn't stay small. Fire never does. At some point, he realized something was wrong. I try to imagine what that moment must have felt like for a 6-year-old. The sudden heat, the smell of smoke, the way fire changes a room almost instantly, turning familiar things into threats. Panic would have set in, but not the kind of panic adults feel. A child's panic is simpler and more terrifying. It's the fear of being in trouble. That's the part that breaks my heart the most. Instead of running outside, instead of screaming for help, instead of understanding that danger mattered more than punishment, he hid. He went into a closet. In his mind, hiding made sense. When kids think they've done something wrong, they hide. They hide under beds, in closets, behind doors. They think if they can't be seen, the problem will somehow stop existing. They don't yet understand that some dangers don't care whether you're seen or not. He closed himself into a small, enclosed space while smoke filled the house. His mother realized something was wrong. I don't know how she noticed. Maybe she smelled smoke. Maybe a neighbor saw something and shouted. Maybe an alarm went off. But at some point, she knew her house was on fire, and she knew her son was inside. She tried to get him to come out. I imagine her voice breaking as she called his name. I imagine the panic rising in her chest as seconds passed and she couldn't find him. When she realized he was hiding, that he was afraid to come out because he thought he was in trouble, the fear must have turned into pure desperation. She begged him. She told him it was okay. She told him he wasn't in trouble. She told him to come out. But he refused. That detail is almost unbearable to think about. A child so afraid of punishment that he stayed hidden while fire and smoke closed in around him. Smoke is especially cruel. It fills small spaces faster. It steals oxygen. It makes you weak and confused long before flames reach you. He died in that closet, not because no one cared, not because no one tried, but because his understanding of the world was still too small to grasp what was happening. He didn't know that the rules had changed, that this wasn't about being scolded or grounded, that this was about survival. By the time help arrived, it was too late. The fire was put out. The house was damaged. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that a 6-year-old boy was gone. The neighborhood changed after that. Not in a dramatic way. There were no memorials on every corner. Life didn't stop. Kids still played outside. People still went to work. But something subtle shifted. Adults watched their children more closely. Matches and lighters disappeared from countertops. Parents talked in hushed voices. Kids overheard things they weren't meant to fully understand. I remember the quiet afterward, the way people spoke his name differently, the way adults looked shaken like they had glimpsed something they couldn't unsee, the way kids were suddenly warned about fire, about not hiding, about always coming out no matter what. I didn't fully understand what had happened at the time. I knew a boy had died. I knew it was because of a fire. I didn't grasp the details until much later. As a child, death feels abstract. It's sad, but it doesn't feel permanent in the way it does once you're older. It wasn't until years later that the full weight of it settled in. When it did, it hit hard. As an adult, I can't stop thinking about how preventable it was. Not in a blaming way, but in a heartbreaking way. How many small assumptions lined up to create that outcome? Assuming a child wouldn't find matches. Assuming a child would know to run. Assuming fear would make him scream instead of hide. Most of all, I think about the lesson he never had the chance to learn. Fire safety messages exist for a reason. Stop, drop, and roll. Don't hide from firefighters. If there's a fire, get out. These phrases are drilled into kids now, but they aren't instinctive. They have to be taught. Without that knowledge, children fall back on what they know, and what they know is fear of punishment. That realization still makes my chest feel tight. I also think about his mother. I can't imagine carrying that, knowing your child is hiding because he thinks he's in trouble. Knowing that your voice couldn't reach him in time, that no amount of love or reassurance could undo the fear in his mind quickly enough. Parents are supposed to protect their children, and when something like this happens, the guilt doesn't go away just because it wasn't intentional. There are no winners in a story like this, only loss. Even now, years later, this memory surfaces in unexpected moments. When I smell smoke from a fireplace, when I hear a fire alarm, when I see kids playing with something they don't understand yet. It reminds me how fragile safety really is, especially for children. It also reminds me how differently children see the world. Adults often assume kids will react logically in emergencies, but children don't think like adults. They don't prioritize danger the same way. They prioritize approval. They prioritize not being in trouble. They hide when they're scared because hiding has worked for smaller problems in the past. That boy didn't make a foolish choice. He made a child's choice, and it cost him his life. The story stayed with me because it wasn't dramatic or sensational. There was no villain, no intentional cruelty, just a moment of curiosity, followed by fear, followed by irreversible consequences. It's the kind of tragedy that makes you realize how easily things can go wrong without anyone meaning for them to. It also changed how I think about teaching kids, not just rules, but priorities, teaching them that safety always comes before punishment, that no matter what they've done, they should never hide from danger, that there are moments when rules don't apply the same way and survival matters more than being good. I wish someone had told him that. I wish he had known that coming out would not have meant punishment, that it would have meant being saved, that the adults around him would have chosen his life over anything else without hesitation. But he didn't know. And that's what makes this story so haunting. It wasn't a malicious act. It wasn't neglect in the obvious sense. It was a gap in understanding between the world adults live in and the world children perceive. A gap that closed in seconds and never reopened. Even now, I think about how quiet a closet must have been as smoke filled the house. How dark it would have been, how confusing, how scared he must have been, and how alone. That image never really leaves you once it forms. This is one of those stories that doesn't shock you with gore or violence, but with sadness. With the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous thing for a child isn't punishment or rules, but not knowing when those rules no longer matter. I don't remember his face clearly anymore, but I remember the feeling his death left behind. A heavy reminder that childhood innocence is fragile, that curiosity can turn deadly without guidance, and that fear can silence a child when they need to be heard the most. That lesson stayed with me, and I wish it hadn't had to be learned that way. I grew up in the same city she did, Elizabeth Smart, Sandy, Utah, a quiet suburban place just south of Salt Lake City, the kind of town where people feel safe leaving doors unlocked and kids ride bikes around the neighborhood without much worry. Nothing about Sandy felt dangerous. That's part of why her story hit so hard and why it stayed with so many of us for so long. I was only 3 years old when she was kidnapped in 2002, so I don't remember the night it happened. I don't remember the fear in real time or the shock when the news broke, but I grew up in the shadow of it. Her name, her face, her story were everywhere during my childhood, especially later toward the end of the decade, when the trials were finally happening and the details were being talked about non-stop. If you lived in Utah at that time, you knew her name. You couldn't avoid it. It was on the news, on the radio, in conversations at school, in churches, in grocery stores. Even as a kid, I absorbed it all. I remember having nightmares about it, repeated ones. Nightmares where the same man broke out of prison and came for me next, where I was taken from my bed in the middle of the night, just like she was. I didn't fully understand the legal process or what a trial meant, but I understood fear. I understood that something unimaginably bad had happened to a girl who lived where I lived, slept in a bed like mine, had parents like mine. That made it feel personal in a way no other crime story ever did. Elizabeth was 14 years old when she was taken. 14. Old enough to understand what was happening, young enough to be completely powerless to stop it. Her family had hired a man to do some work on their house. He came into their lives in a way that seemed ordinary, normal, safe. He wasn't some stranger lurking in the shadows. He was someone who had been inside their home, someone they trusted enough to let near their children. That man later snuck back into the house in the middle of the night. He entered through Elizabeth's bedroom window, armed with a knife. He woke her, threatened her, and forced her to leave with him. Her little sister was in the room with her and witnessed part of the kidnapping. That detail alone is horrifying. A child watching their sibling be taken away, knowing something is wrong but not being able to stop it. That moment alone would traumatize a family forever. Elizabeth's father ran after them when he realized what was happening, but it was too late. The man escaped with her into the night. What happened next made the situation even worse in a way few people outside of Utah fully grasped at the time. For a long while, suspicion fell on her father because there were no immediate leads, no obvious suspect, no clear explanation. In the absence of answers, people started pointing fingers where they shouldn't have. He was questioned extensively, accused. I believe he was even arrested and held for a time. The pressure on that family was unimaginable. Not only was their daughter missing, likely in danger, but the public and media were tearing them apart, suggesting the unthinkable. For a long time, many people believed he was guilty. That fact still makes me angry when I think about it. A man who had just lost his child in the most terrifying way possible, forced to defend himself against accusations while desperately hoping she was still alive somewhere. It was only later, when the real perpetrators were found, that his name was cleared. But the damage done by that suspicion can never fully be undone. Elizabeth was held captive for 9 months. 9 months that felt like an eternity. She was held by the man who kidnapped her and his wife. Together they subjected her to repeated sexual assault, almost daily. They kept her under constant control, using fear, isolation, and violence to break her down. What made this case even more disturbing was the way they justified what they were doing. They had created their own twisted version of Mormonism. Mormonism is the dominant religion in Utah, and Elizabeth herself was raised in it. The captors knew this. They used it. They warped religious concepts to suit their desires, convincing themselves that what they were doing was righteous, even holy. They believed the man was a prophet of God. They believed he was carrying out divine instructions. They performed a sealing ceremony, which in Mormon belief is a marriage ceremony meant to bind people together for eternity. They claimed that Elizabeth was now spiritually married to her captor, not just in this life, but in the afterlife as well. This wasn't just abuse, it was psychological torture layered on top of physical and sexual violence. They kept her tied up for much of her captivity. Over time, Elizabeth learned a brutal truth. Any attempt to escape would likely get her killed. She wasn't just being watched. She was being controlled by people who truly believed they were doing God's work. That kind of belief is terrifying because it leaves no room for mercy. When someone believes they are divinely justified, there is no limit to what they can convince themselves is acceptable. Eventually, Elizabeth did something extraordinary. She adapted. She realized that the only way to survive was to make them believe she believed. She began pretending to accept their religion, their beliefs, their authority. She convinced them she was no longer a threat, that she wouldn't run, that she was loyal. Over time, they loosened some of their restrictions on her, believing they had successfully brainwashed her. There have always been rumors that she truly was brainwashed. She has always denied that. She has consistently said that she was never mentally converted, that she was acting, surviving, doing what she needed to do to stay alive. That distinction matters. It speaks to her strength, her awareness, and her will to live, even under circumstances that would have broken most people. One of the most chilling details of the case came later. At one point, the man claimed to have had a vision from God. In this vision, he believed he was instructed to kidnap Elizabeth's cousin, who was around the same age. The plan was to take her as well and marry her to him, subjecting her to the same abuse. It is widely believed that if Elizabeth had not been rescued when she was, this would have happened. Or at the very least, an attempt would have been made. That knowledge alone is enough to make your blood run cold. For much of those 9 months, the three of them lived in the wilderness. They camped in the mountains and deserts, moving frequently to avoid detection. They only went into public on rare occasions, and when they did, they wore heavy disguises, wigs, veils, layers of clothing, anything to hide their faces and identities. There were times when they nearly starved, times when they nearly died of thirst. Elizabeth endured not only abuse but constant deprivation, fear, and exposure, heat, cold, hunger, illness, all while being controlled by people who believed they owned her body and soul. Despite the disguises and isolation, cracks eventually formed. One day they went out in public wearing disguises that weren't good enough. If I remember correctly, they were in a Target store in Sandy. Ordinary place, ordinary day, and that's what makes it so surreal. Among aisles of clothes and household items, surrounded by normal people living normal lives, someone recognized them. Shoppers had seen an episode of America's Most Wanted. They recognized the man and the woman. They called the police. Law enforcement responded quickly. They blocked off the exits and waited. When the three of them came outside, officers moved in and arrested them. Just like that, after 9 months of terror, Elizabeth was free. The relief across Utah was overwhelming. People cried, strangers hugged, churches held prayer services. The fear that had hung over the state for so long finally loosened its grip. She was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. The legal process took years. The man was eventually sentenced in 2011 to 2 life sentences. The wife received 15 years in 2009 as part of a plea deal and was credited for time already served. She was released on parole last year. That fact alone is still deeply unsettling to many people. Elizabeth, meanwhile, did something that few people in her position could ever do. She chose not to disappear. She chose to speak. She became an activist, using her voice to help victims of kidnapping, rape, and human trafficking all over the world. She helped push for the implementation of the Amber Alert system in the United States, a system that has since saved countless children. In 2011, she founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, dedicated to preventing sexual violence and human trafficking and supporting survivors. She reclaimed her life. She went to college. She earned a bachelor's degree in music, specializing in harp performance. She got married. She has 3 children. She built a future that was almost stolen from her completely. She also helped create a television movie about her experience, which she narrated herself. That's where much of what I know comes from, along with public records and her own words. It's not an easy film to watch. It shouldn't be. But it is powerful, honest, and deeply human. Growing up with her story in the background shaped how I see the world. It taught me that danger doesn't always look like danger, that monsters don't always come from outside your life. Sometimes they walk in through your front door carrying tools and pretending to help. It taught me that religion, when twisted, can be used as a weapon, that trust can be exploited, that safety can be an illusion. But it also taught me something else. Survival is possible, even when it seems impossible. Elizabeth's strength didn't come from being fearless. It came from being adaptable, intelligent, and determined to live. She didn't survive because she was lucky, though luck played a role. She survived because she refused, quietly and internally, to give up who she was. For those of us who grew up in Utah, her story became a kind of collective scar, a reminder that even quiet suburbs are not immune to horror. But it also became a story of resilience, courage, and recovery. She could have been defined forever by what was done to her. Instead, she chose to define herself by what she did afterward. And that is why, even though her story terrified me as a child and haunted my dreams, it also left me with a deep respect for the human capacity to endure, to heal, and to fight back in the most powerful way possible, by living. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.